The sun had just begun to fade behind the jagged hills of coast, painting the sky in copper and smoke when Captain Evelyn Hartman thought the mission was over. The radio was quiet, the valley below seemed calm, and for a fleeting second, the world looked almost beautiful. Then came the gunfire, sharp, desperate bursts cutting through the stillness like lightning through dry air. The voice on the comm cracked with static. "We're pinned down, they're everywhere." The calm she'd felt just seconds earlier vanished, replaced by the kind of dread that makes even the bravest soldier forget to breathe. Her hands gripped the throttle, the engines of her A-10 Thunderbolt II roaring like a beast begging to be unleashed. Before we dive into what happened next, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and if you've ever heard that kind of silence right before everything falls apart. Enjoy the story. The command tower's voice came through sharp and sterile. "Abort mission." That's an order, but Evelyn didn't hear it, or maybe she chose not to. Down below, a convoy of SEALs was trapped in a canyon that looked more like the mouth of hell, with smoke and debris swallowing every scream. She'd flown countless missions before, but something in this one felt different. Maybe it was the tone of the soldier's voice on the radio. Young, afraid, the kind that doesn't survive long enough to sound old. Or maybe it was the eerie realization that no one else was coming for them. She throttled forward, ignoring the procedures, the regulations, the very oath she had sworn. At 30,000 feet, she was a model officer. At 300, she was a ghost flying against her own chain of command. The ground rose to meet her faster than expected. The trees scraped the belly of her plane, sparks flashing like fireflies in a nightmare. She lined up the coordinates manually, heart pounding in rhythm with the rattling fuselage. "Hold position," she muttered into the headset, not to the SEALs, not to anyone in particular, maybe just to herself. Then she squeezed the trigger. The Ju-8 cannon erupted in a thunderous roar, shredding the ridgeline with precision fire. The valley became a storm of dirt and metal, tracer rounds streaking like molten veins across the dusk. Through the haze, she saw men crawling for cover, flames licking the edges of their uniforms. Yet the line of fire carved a path for them, an opening, a chance to live. When the gunfire ceased, only the hum of her engines filled the silence. The radio hissed with static, then nothing. No confirmation, no thank you, no voice at all. Evelyn pulled the A-10 upward, climbing back toward the clouds as the adrenaline drained out of her like blood through an open wound. Her palms trembled against the control stick and her breathing grew uneven. She had done what she came to do, but something inside her whispered that it wasn't over, that this silence was heavier than any explosion. By the time she landed back at the forward base, the horizon behind her was a wall of smoke. Mechanics rushed to meet her, their faces pale, their eyes darting between the scorched fuselage and the absence of authorization papers. "Captain, this mission wasn't cleared," one of them said, his voice shaking more from fear of the report than the pilot standing before him. Evelyn didn't answer. She just pulled off her helmet, her blonde hair soaked with sweat, and stared at the horizon, the direction where men were either dead or alive because of her. Inside the command tent, the atmosphere was suffocating. Radios squawked, officers shouted coordinates, and the smell of burned coffee mingled with cordite and diesel. Evelyn stood at the entrance, still in her flight suit, her boots covered in mud that wasn't all mud. Her superior officer turned toward her, face pale under the dim light. "Hartman," he said, "you disobeyed direct orders." His tone was rehearsed, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of something else. Maybe admiration, maybe horror. She didn't defend herself. She didn't need to. The outcome of the mission would speak louder than any regulation. Outside, the night air carried the echo of distant rotor blades. Medevac helicopters were ferrying the wounded to safety. Some of those men had called her name through static not an hour ago. Now some of them would never speak again. Evelyn walked out into the open field, her boots sinking slightly in the wet dirt. She watched the stretchers being unloaded, the faces half covered in grime, the faint murmurs of pain mixing with the metallic clatter of tools. The moon hung low and blood orange over the camp, as if the sky itself felt guilty. For a brief moment, she saw a boy, no older than 20, maybe less, clutching his bleeding shoulder as medics worked to keep him awake. His eyes found hers, and there was recognition there, though they had never met. He didn't smile. He just nodded once, slow, as if to say, "You came." It was the smallest gesture, yet it hit her harder than any reprimand ever could. Evelyn looked away before the tears had the chance to surface. Hours later, when the engines had cooled and the chaos turned into whispers, she sat alone beside her aircraft. The metal was scorched, the paint blistered, the right wing riddled with small punctures. She ran her hand along the cold surface, feeling the vibration still lingering inside, like the ghost of the machine's rage. She thought about how close she'd come to losing control, to becoming a casualty instead of a savior. The irony of it all was that in trying to save lives, she might have just destroyed her own career. Her headset crackled again, this time softer, almost hesitant. "Captain Hartman, command wants a full report at 600. She replied with a quiet, "Copy that," though her voice was hollow. There was nothing left to report that wouldn't sound like confession. She turned off the comms and stared at her reflection in the canopy glass. A face carved by exhaustion, smeared with ash and defiance. Somewhere beneath all that, there was still the same pilot who once believed in rules, in procedures, in the clean symmetry of military logic. But tonight, she had flown beyond all that, into something raw and human, and there was no coming back untouched. When dawn finally broke, the camp looked like a painting smeared in grey and gold. Smoke still rose from the direction of the valley, curling lazily into the cold air. Evelyn stood at the edge of the tarmac, helmet tucked under her arm, eyes fixed on the horizon. Behind her, someone called her name, but she didn't turn. The sound of boots on gravel faded, replaced by the slow, steady rhythm of her own heartbeat. It echoed like the distant roll of thunder, a reminder of the roar that had once saved lives and condemned her all at once. She could already feel the weight of what was coming. The inquiries, the hearings, the cold language of bureaucracy that would try to erase what she'd done under the banner of discipline. But none of that mattered now. She had seen too much, felt too much. Somewhere in that burning valley, pieces of herself had been left behind, fragments of faith, of obedience, of who she used to be before the echoes of war taught her that sometimes the right thing and the allowed thing are not the same. And as the first transport plane took off in the distance, its engines rumbling like a tired heartbeat across the morning air, Evelyn Hartman closed her eyes for just a moment. The sound reminded her of her father's old stories about courage, how it never comes clean, how it always leaves a scar. She smiled faintly, though there was no joy in it. The war hadn't ended that night. It had simply changed shape, and now it lived inside her, quiet and waiting, like the valley that devoured echoes and gave nothing back. The makeshift field hospital sprawled like a wounded animal on the edge of the runway, canvas ribs snapping in the hot wind, while generators coughed brown breath into the night. And Evelyn pushed through the flap with her helmet tucked tight against her chest as if it were a shield that had suddenly learned shame. The cots were crowded into crooked rows, boots sticking out like headstones, and the air was thick with iodine, diesel, and the raw copper of blood that clung to the throat. She moved quickly because slow meant seeing too much, because every face, once stared at, became a decision you might never stop defending. Medics wove past her with bags of fluid held high. Orderlies shouted names that already sounded like eulogies, and she kept her gaze on the far wall where a shadow flickered and settled the way a memory does when it refuses to behave. She almost missed him, because the haircut had changed and the beard was new, but the angle of the eyes was the same as the man who taught her to hold her breath before a free throw, and to never blink at the moment the ball left her hands. And that was how she knew the man on the cot was Ethan Hartman, long before his chest rose and fell with a stubborn rhythm that felt like an argument resurrected. His left sleeve was torn away and a bandage rode high along the bicep, the white already turning grey with dust, and he was awake, not fever dreaming, not broken in the way that ends conversations. He was simply there, looking at her with the startled calm of a diver who surfaces and finds the wrong shoreline. No one said a word. He didn't reach for her and she didn't lean in. Because there are distances you can only cross once. And they both knew, the last time they'd tried, the bridge burned from both ends. A medic stepped between them, checked Ethan's pupils with a small light. Barked numbers that meant things were stable enough for the night. And Evelyn held herself still to keep from intruding on science with whatever this was that boiled under the flight suit. The cot opposite squealed as someone turned over, bandages rasping against fabric. Outside, a helicopter lifted, dragging the air with it and making the tent bow and snap like a reprimand. Ethan blinked, then sat up with a wince that he refused to name. And that was when the recognition flickered into something harder, a question without punctuation. "You? Here now?" She nodded once. The precise, economical gesture they'd both learned from the same father and then used on each other like a blade. The medic moved on, and the space between them filled with the old house in Wichita Falls, with summer cicadas and the slam of a screen door, with their father's boots by the mat and the smell of oil from the garage. It filled with a night 6 years ago when Ethan had walked out after saying he wouldn't serve under a country that valued rules over people, and their father had told him rules were the only thing that kept people alive. And Evelyn had tried to stay neutral and failed in a way that looked like choosing a side. He'd left under a different last name to join a different branch, taking with him the family photograph where she'd been 12 and he 16, both of them sunburned and squinting over a fishing line that refused to sink. She had blamed him for the silence that followed and hated herself for the blame. He had blamed her for staying and hated himself for the relief of not having to explain. Now the tent made a low thunder as if remembering the A-10's voice, and Ethan touched the edge of his bandage like a man checking a lock. "I thought you were in Nevada," he said finally, not quite a question. His words long enough to carry weight but short enough to hide the parts that would require open heart work. "I was," she answered, and the simplicity of it startled her because it sounded like a confession disguised as logistics. He looked past her to the flap where stretcher teams vanished and returned, and his jaw worked once before stilling. The same old tick from 1,000 family dinners where he'd tried to measure temper against consequence. "We called for support," he said, and it was not gratitude or accusation, only weather. Support was denied. "I heard what I heard," she replied, and if there was a tremor it was not from fear, but from the pitch of certain choices when they passed through bone. A young corpsman stumbled between them with a tray of instruments, a clang of metal that made Ethan flinch, and Evelyn not flinch at all. She placed her helmet on the floor, careful, because ritual is sometimes the only thing that reenacts control. "You're using another name," she added, and he smiled without humor, a quick baring of teeth like a man showing he still has them. "Ethan March," he said, and the lie was so practiced it felt like a truth carved by necessity. "Keeps conversations short." A clipboard appeared in Evelyn's hands, and she realized she'd taken it from a passing nurse without thinking. She set it on the neighboring cot and pulled the metal pen loop straight as if that could make time behave. "Mom still asked for you at Christmas," she said, and they both knew it was a mercy bullet meant to graze. "I send money," he answered, which landed with the stubborn weight of a man who has decided responsibility can wear a mask and still count. The tent lights flickered. The generator coughed and caught. Somewhere outside, a dog barked, as if remembering a backyard that had never been built here. He looked back to her with a soldier's focus that made civilians uncomfortable. "You broke procedure," he said, not an accusation, not even curiosity. More like a field note. "Procedure broke first," she said, and that was the end of it, because neither of them believed in prolonged debates under morphine and canvas. A medic returned with a small pill cup. Ethan swallowed without grimace, then leaned back against the thin pillow and let his head rest as if the cot had finally negotiated a ceasefire with his spine. "I'm with a team moving north at daybreak," he said, And Evelyn felt something old and mean rise up, a sister's need to dismantle the world that had decided it owned him. "You're not moving anywhere until that arm stops telling the truth," she replied. And he laughed once, the laugh of a man who knows pain is a negotiator with a long memory. "You have no jurisdiction here, Captain," he said. But there was warmth in the rank and the word, a nod to the younger years when titles were games they played in the yard. They fell quiet, and the quiet was not comfortable, but it was honest in a way that felt more useful than comfort. She sat on the footlocker and loosened the strap of her glove. He closed his eyes for a moment and opened them again, with that steady, infuriating calm he'd always weaponized against her impatience. Outside, tires crunched on gravel, a convoy coming in with stories that would be told badly and remembered too well. Inside, a nurse whispered a prayer while taping down a line, and the tent swallowed it with professional discretion. "You know Dad wanted to be a pilot," Ethan said softly, as if trying to reopen an old door without waking the house. He wanted out of the plant. The night shifts ate his back. Evelyn stared at her hands, the pale lines where the gloves pressed, and pictured their father tilting his head to listen to distant engines in the Oklahoma dark. He wanted a rule book he could finish, she said, and the truth of it made them both look away. When the medics finally shooed visitors to the perimeter, Evelyn walked the length of the tent with the stubborn cadence of someone refusing to give the ground a chance to pull her down, then slipped into the cooler night where the stars were brighter than they had any right to be over such a day. The tarmac glistened in patches where fuel had spilled and found nothing to burn, and she stood by the shadowed curve of her warthog, drawing slow breaths until the urge to punch something quieted into the more sustainable ache of discipline. She found a rag in the tool chest, found the sidearm in her thigh holster, and sat on the wheel well to clean it with the kind of attention that steals hours. She didn't need the weapon tonight, and might not need it tomorrow. But the ritual mattered because metal is honest about what it can and cannot do. And honesty felt like the rarest commodity in a place that smelled like promises after they're broken. By the time the first hint of grey climbed the edges of the hills, she had reassembled the slide with a soft click that sounded exactly like acceptance and nothing like surrender. A runner from the command tent showed up with a sealed envelope, and she recognized the thickness of forms without needing to break the glue. She shoved it into her thigh pocket and refused to let her hand linger, because reading it now would make her walk to Ethan's cot and say sentences she didn't yet have collateral to pay for. Instead, she went back to the tent, paused at the flap, and watched him sleep with the stubborn quiet of a man who had decided dreams were a luxury. He looked both older and young enough to terrify her, and she permitted herself one small, treasonous thought that fate had a sick sense of humor, hauling them across continents just to sit them down in the same room and remind them that blood obeys logistics only when it wants to. She did not wake him. She left a folded note on the metal tray. Just initials and a time, and the outline of a plan that was not a plan so much as an admission that she would be at the tarmac when his orders tried to bully his body into pretending it was healed. Then she stepped back into the morning and adjusted her collar, and felt the grit scratch the line of her throat like a warning. They had found each other not through forgiveness, but through coincidence that looked like a sentence. Nothing about the day asked for reconciliation, and nothing offered it. She started toward the operations shack with her gait trimmed to regulation, and behind her the generators droned, and the tent canvas trembled, and the valley beyond the runway held its breath the way it always did, as if waiting for a roar that it knew by heart. The same roar that had carried her here and would not stop asking what price she was willing to keep paying. The reports multiplied before sunrise, sterile documents breeding like frost across command inboxes, each one framed in the safe grammar of liability, unauthorized engagement, deviation from flight plan, probable exposure to civilian infrastructure, risk accepted without proper authority. Her sortie map, once a thin ribbon between waypoints, became a courtroom exhibit, and the after-action packets were stapled with red tabs that said everything without using her name. Evelyn sat through the first debrief with the posture of a parade rest carved into bone, listening as colonels who had never flown that canyon spoke of proportionality and escalation ladders as if those had been visible through smoke and tracer fire. She answered cleanly, a pilot's economy married to a witness's precision, and the recorder clicked with the faint, predatory patience of a clock waiting for someone to run out of time. By noon, the narrative had been solid, heroic rescue adjacent, policy violation central. Someone read back her own transmission, the brief, steady tone with which she'd told herself to hold position, and asked if she understood how such language could be interpreted as unilateral initiative. She kept her hands folded on the table as the legal officer laid out potential Article 92 violations, with the caution of a man placing explosives. She agreed to nothing, refused nothing, simply admitted facts in the order they occurred, because in the air, sequence is the only truth. Outside, medevacs thumped, and a chaplain crossed the tarmac with a book tucked under his arm. And the dissonance of moving life around fixed language felt like trying to make a propeller run inside a museum. Ethan appeared without announcement. Hair-combed, sleeve-ironed, the new name on his breast a line drawn through history. Into captain's bars that had not been there yesterday, catching the light like a compromise. The promotion was delivered in a quiet office with no cameras and too many witnesses, and he accepted it with the eyes of a man who knew decorum is sometimes camouflage. He asked for 5 minutes with the board, and they gave him 2, and he used both to compress a convoy's worth of chaos into a single argument, that she acted in the obvious service of forces on the ground who would otherwise be filling caskets. When the door closed behind him, Evelyn met his gaze and shook her head once, not in rejection, but in warning, because family cannot be an affidavit and still remain family. He grimaced, then stood down with the reflex of a soldier who knows when a line has been marked in chalk and in blood. The second panel convened in a room cold enough to keep meat, its walls decorated with framed jets that never missed target, nor disobeyed a single order. And the chair read aloud the phrases built to carry institutional weight. Exemplary record, grave concern, mitigating circumstances, precedent, message to the force. She recognized the rhythm, praise that collects like dust before the broom arrives, and kept her answers spare, describing altitude, wind shear, and the geometry of fire like a math teacher who refuses to dress equations in sentiment. When asked whether she perceived civilians near the ridgeline, she explained the sensor's limitations, the angle of approach, the way dusk turns every roof into intent. The JAG made a note that sounded like a gavel. Someone asked if she regretted her decision. She said that if the board could certify that the men she'd heard over the radio would have made it out unassisted, she would regret it entirely. Until then, she would let the dead decide if they needed her apology. Orders always travel faster than mercy. By evening, headquarters had decided to make a point without making a scandal, and the solution came dressed as courtesy, relieved of flight status pending final disposition, accompanied by formal recognition of prior valor, reassigned to ground duties at headquarters until the matter could be contextualized. It was the kind of sentence that looks generous in a press release and lands like a punch in a locker room. She signed for a temporary pass, surrendered her sidearm and flight kneeboard, and felt the odd lightness of pockets that had learned the shape of tools. In the squadron bay, the crew chief would not meet her eyes, and the youngest wrench turned away quickly, as if caught stealing. The maintenance sergeant, who had once barked at her for scratching a panel with an errant buckle, murmured, "Ma'am," with a tenderness that resembled grief. News traveled outward in the way truth never does. Public Affairs drafted a statement about the complexity of modern battlefields. A senator praised discipline while praising sacrifice, and the morning show host smiled over footage of returning units framed by flags that looked vacuum-sealed. Somewhere, a montage rolled to a country song about home. At the same hour, Evelyn laid her pilot wings on a green felt pad for cataloguing, the metal still warm from near skin, and for a moment she understood why retirees sometimes keep them in the nightstand, like a talisman against waking up in a life that doesn't know your name. She turned in her squadron patch, the one with the boar's head and the motto about thunder, and accepted the replacement badge that meant staff, a middle syllable between service and silence. Ethan found her on the flight line at twilight, the runway lights winking alive like a truth trying to survive a blackout, and he stood beside her without preface. The talk they had was longer than comfort and shorter than repair. He told her the convoy had made it, that 3 men owed her more birthdays, that one had asked for the pilot's name to send a letter the system would never deliver. He said the promotion felt like a bribe and a punishment that could share a chair without fighting. She said she understood, because sometimes institutions and families use the same furniture. He asked if she wanted him to keep pushing. She said no, not because she didn't need it, but because she needed him to keep the parts of himself the war hadn't traded away. They stood there until an instructor took off in the pattern and her body leaned forward automatically, the way a former dancer leans when music begins. The formal ceremony, if you could call it that, took place in a low room with a flag in the corner and a sheet cake whose frosting carried a misspelled last name. The colonel spoke from a script about gratitude for her distinguished service and continued contributions, and presented a certificate whose font was chosen to overpower doubt. She shook the hands that were offered, received the slow claps that mean, "We see you but can't afford to say so," and posed for a photo where everyone looked slightly left of the lens, as if trying to avoid eye contact with history. Afterwards, she boxed her flight suit, slid the gloves on top with the palms folded, and tucked a small cloth patch at the very bottom, a boar's head that had seen too much and would see nothing else. When she stepped out into the parking lot, the sky was a clean civilian blue, and the bass loudspeakers played a recorded bugle that made her think of high school bands and cold metal bleachers. The nation was in a mood to celebrate victories that fit on a ticker, and somewhere a stadium crowd roared at halftime while a camera cut away before the commercial break. In the base exchange, a cashier argued about coupons. At the chapel, a bride adjusted a veil while a groomsman checked his phone for scores. The world had the indecency to keep moving, and she discovered this was both a comfort and an insult. She placed the box in the trunk, closed it with a soft thud, and rested her hands on the lid until the heat left her palms. That night, in quarters that smelled faintly of new paint and old soap, she laid awake with the window cracked, listening to the occasional taxi of a transport aircraft and the farther hum of an interstate that connected cities that would never know her name. The roar of the GAU-8 lived behind her ribs like a second pulse, not the violent crescendo of action, but the low aftertone of consequence, and she realized the sound would not fade with distance. She thought of the word example as headquarters used it and as her father used it, and the difference between them felt like the difference between a warning sign and a lighthouse. Both glow, but only one tries to bring you home. She did not cry because tears would have demanded a cause clean enough to isolate. Instead, she breathed evenly, one measured intake after another, the way she had been. Trained to ride turbulence until the weather exhausted its temper. In the morning, she would report to a desk with a view of the motor pool and the duty of editing training syllabi to remove ambiguities commanders feared more than enemy fire. And she would do it well because competence was a habit she was unwilling to break just to spite the system that had decided to teach her a lesson. She would ignore the quips about grounded angels, would nod at the new lieutenant who tried too hard, would let the phone ring twice before answering so the caller could hear his own uncertainty. And somewhere in that day, in a break room where the coffee tasted like burnt coins, she would catch a news segment celebrating a victory in a province she knew by smell, and the anchor would say the word stability with a smile designed to reassure investors. She would switch off the screen, and the silence that followed would feel exactly like the valley did after the last round left the barrels. Not peaceful, not finished, but waiting for the next person brave or foolish enough to break it. The letter arrived without warning, sealed in a pale envelope that carried the smell of dust and machine ink, its corners creased from the journey across an ocean Evelyn would never see again. She found it wedged among grocery flyers and a bill for electricity, the military emblem pressed faintly into the paper like a bruise that refused to heal. Her hands did not shake when she opened it. They simply slowed, as if her body already knew what her mind refused to name. The words were spare and merciless. Her brother, Captain A-10 Hartman, though the letter used his assumed surname, had been killed during an evacuation near the Afghan border. Enemy contact, compromised extraction, no survivors retrieved. The phrasing was surgical, devoid of narrative, as if loss were best handled in bullet points. Evelyn sat at the kitchen table in her small house outside Fort Worth, the late afternoon light slicing the room into quiet pieces, and read it twice before folding it back along the original crease, a ritual of containment rather than disbelief. She placed the letter beside a coffee mug that had gone cold hours ago, the rim stained like a fingerprint from another life. Around her, the house seemed too intact, too polite to host grief, as if waiting for permission to fall apart. She stared at the framed photo on the wall, a graduation snapshot where A-10 stood beside her in a borrowed uniform, both of them smiling with the reckless certainty of people who still thought destiny could be negotiated. Now that smile felt like a crime scene. She did not cry. Instead, she exhaled slowly, as if releasing ballast to keep from sinking. For a long moment, she listened to the refrigerator hum, the faint tick of a clock, the ordinary noises of a world unbroken, and realized that tragedy never arrives like thunder. It seeps in, steady and soundless, until it fills the room. The funeral at Arlington came under a low, cold sky that smelled faintly of rain. Rows of white headstones stretched like piano keys into the horizon, each one a note of someone else's unfinished song. Evelyn stood in uniform, her cap pulled tight, the silver edges of her ribbons dulled by the mist. The honor guard performed its duties with precision that felt almost cruel. The synchronized steps, the fold of the flag into a triangle so sharp it could cut. She watched as it was placed into her hands, the fabric heavy and warm, as if it still remembered his body beneath it. The chaplain spoke words about sacrifice and duty, phrases worn smooth by repetition, and the sound of the bugle rose like a wound through the air. When the rifles fired their salute, the echo rolled across the fields and died somewhere beyond the trees, leaving behind a silence too disciplined to be natural. After the crowd thinned and the officers drifted toward their cars, she stayed. Her shoes were sunk slightly into the wet earth, the mud pulling at her heels as though trying to keep her there. The grave marker bore his false name, the alias under which he had lived and died, and she wondered if anyone besides her would ever know who truly lay beneath it. She knelt briefly, her knees pressing into the cold ground, and rested her fingers on the engraved letters. It was a gesture without prayer, without plea, simply an attempt to confirm that the world still responded to touch. The wind moved through the cemetery like breath, stirring the flags and the thin branches overhead. Somewhere far off, an aircraft passed, its engines low and constant, a sound too familiar to be ignored. For a moment she imagined it was him, one last flight, one last defiance of gravity, and she raised her head to follow it until the sound dissolved into the overcast sky. That night, she returned home with the folded flag balanced on the passenger seat beside her, the headlights carving tunnels of light through the rain. She placed the flag on the kitchen table, exactly where the letter had been, and sat across from it as if expecting a conversation. The air smelled faintly of wet asphalt and old coffee. Her hands itched for something to do, so she reached for the leather jacket hanging on the back of a chair, the one she'd worn during her last flight. Inside the inner pocket, she found the small dog tag Ethan had slipped to her years ago, engraved with his real name and a date of enlistment that had felt like a promise at the time. She closed her fist around it, the metal warming against her skin, and whispered nothing because words were too small to hold what pressed against her chest. Sleep refused to come. The rain had stopped, but left behind a rhythm, the soft dripping from the eaves, steady as a metronome, marking the minutes she couldn't spend elsewhere. At one point, she opened the drawer of her bedside table and found the pilot's logbook she had kept since her cadet years. The pages smelled faintly of jet fuel and pencil lead. She flipped to the last recorded mission, the unauthorized strike, the one that had saved men she didn't know and cost her everything else, and traced the inked coordinates with her thumb. Below them, she wrote a new entry, loss confirmed. No witnesses, no flight path, no return. She closed the book and pressed it against her chest until the paper creaked. In the days that followed, the military sent forms for signature, documents about personal effects, medals, burial confirmation, posthumous commendation. Each form came with a letterhead and a deadline. She filled them out with the precision of habit, her handwriting immaculate, her tone detached. The mail carrier offered condolences once, awkwardly, and she thanked him with the faint smile of someone unwilling to share oxygen with sympathy. The world continued its routine. Neighbors mowing lawns, children chasing basketballs down the street, a dog barking at shadows. To them, the war existed only on screens. To her, it was a ghost sitting at the kitchen table every morning, invisible but unignorable. When the Pentagon invited her to a memorial service for fallen personnel, she declined. She didn't need speeches or medals polished for cameras. Instead, she drove alone back toward the base, stopping at the airfield's perimeter fence, where her A-10s used to roar down the runway. The hangars were quiet now, the tarmac slick with early fog. She leaned against the chain link, listening to the distant hum of engines preparing for takeoff somewhere beyond sight. The smell of fuel reached her like memory, sharp and intoxicating. For a brief moment she could almost hear her brother's voice, steady, irreverent, telling her to keep the nose low. Let the sky do the heavy lifting. It wasn't real. She knew that, but she didn't push it away. Some ghosts deserve the courtesy of being heard. Back at home, she cleaned the kitchen as if it were an act of penance. Dishes, counters, floors, all scrubbed until they gleamed. It wasn't about order. It was about control, about proving that some things could still be put back together. When she finished, she poured a drink, not to forget but to mark the hour. Outside, the sky turned from gray to black to a soft blue haze, the kind that comes just before dawn. She opened the back door and stepped out barefoot, the ground cold against her soles. The air smelled of wet grass and electricity. Above her, a plane crossed the horizon, its lights blinking like a heartbeat. She didn't know if it was military or civilian, and she didn't care. For a moment, the distance between sky and earth felt paper-thin, as if someone could reach through and touch what was gone. When the sun rose, she folded the flag again, once, twice, 3 times, before placing it inside the old flight jacket on the back of the chair. She didn't need it displayed. She needed it close, quiet, something to anchor the mornings that would follow. She brewed coffee, sat by the window, and watched the street wake up. The world had the audacity to continue, and she found, to her surprise, that she didn't resent it. Maybe that was survival, not defiance or strength, just the quiet acceptance that time moves forward even when hearts don't. Evelyn stayed at the table long after the mug had emptied, her gaze fixed on the thin line of light spreading across the floor. The dog tag was still in her hand. She slipped it over her neck, the chain cold against her skin, and closed her eyes. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the engines of another plane began to climb, low and distant. She listened until the sound faded completely, leaving behind that heavy, almost sacred silence that only pilots truly understand. The silence after flight, when the world feels suspended between loss and continuation. And the sky, for a brief heartbeat, belongs entirely to memory. The Texas heat felt older than the base itself, pressing down on the concrete like a hand that refused to lift, and Evelyn stepped into it each morning with a clipboard, a stopwatch, and the quiet resolve of someone who had learned to live on the far side of noise. The posting came with a title, Instructor, Advanced Air to Ground, and an office with a window that looked out on taxi lines baked the color of bone. She learned the rhythm of schedules, the smell of hydraulic fluid at dawn, the voices of young pilots whose confidence ran faster than their judgment. She spoke little, because words could rescue or ruin, and she had seen both. And most days, she preferred to let the weather and the syllabus do the heavy lifting while she watched the way hands moved on throttles when a heart started running too hot. They came in waves. Fresh haircuts, bright eyes, the brave ignorance that turns checklists into shields, and she sorted them in her head without malice. The gambler who believed in luck, the calculator who believed in charts, the quiet one who believed in gravity. She gave them the same lesson wrapped in different problems, the kind that began clean and then bent in the middle. Crosswinds that didn't read forecasts, radios that went mute at dirty altitudes, targets that looked right until the angle lied. She let them navigate the bend until the blood reached their faces, and then tapped the canopy with a knuckle, a small sound that meant step back from the cliff. When they asked what the tap meant, she said it was the distance between bravery and stubbornness. And if they didn't hear it on their own someday, they'd hear it from a flag folded tight. Her classroom was a simulator bay that hummed like a heart with too many wires. She adjusted scenarios with the cruelty of compassion. Fuel down 5%, weather dropping a ceiling like a trapdoor, a convoy appearing late where ordnance is. Would make a headline if students forgot where people live. She stood behind them as they flew inside the boxes, arms crossed, eyes on the mirrored world, offering corrections in sentences long enough to hold a lesson and short enough to land before ego woke up. When a student tried to rush a strafe run, she had him slow to the arithmetic of distance and descent. When another floated on approach, she made him fly the pattern until fatigue taught what pride could not. After she sent them outside to stand alone by the runway and listen to the wind scrape its knuckles on the fencing, because silence makes better punctuation than applause. The stories about her moved through the barracks slow at first, and then quick, never accurate enough to sting, but near enough to make the young look up when she entered. Some said she'd flown a canyon by Braille. Some said she'd argued a general out of his stars. Others, more superstitious, said she carried an extra set of wings in her pocket like a talisman against gravity. She did nothing to encourage or correct the tales. The only myth she permitted in her presence was the checklist, and even that she treated like scripture with footnotes. In the evening, she wrote debriefs stripped of drama, names, timestamps, errors you could measure with a ruler. She left out the ghosts, kept the dead on her side of the paper. They were heavy, and paper couldn't hold them. There was a hotshot named Kemp who loved the feel of the throttle more than the map. He chased speed the way a dog chases a truck, not to catch it, but to prove the road belonged to him. She broke him slow rather than hard, pairing him with the most cautious flyer in the cohort and giving them a sortie with one good decision hidden beneath a dozen tempting mistakes. When Kemp finally flew the profile without skipping a line, she said, "You're not fast, you're early, be on time." He called it pedantry in the lounge. 2 weeks later, he called it gospel from a cockpit that came home with fuel to spare and a landing you could drink coffee through. There was a woman named Ruiz, whose hands shook before every sim and stilled only in the air. Evelyn sat with her on the steps at dusk and talked about systems as if naming parts might talk fear into smaller shapes. Ruiz learned to trust her hands, first and her fear later, and Evelyn felt something like relief watching someone's fight end in a draw rather than a verdict. She kept her distance from their off-hours lives. She didn't go to the base bar, didn't linger in the PX to be recognized near the coffee aisle, didn't sign flight patches that would be framed on dorm walls. She preferred the flight line. when the sun dropped and the jets threw long shadows that looked like the past trying to outrun itself. She walked the perimeter with the dog tag under her collar, winking a small circle against bone. And sometimes she caught herself turning toward the run-up area when an engine coughed the way the warthog used to cough, an old reflexed loyalty that embarrassed her even as it warmed. The world inside her had cooled to something quieter than adrenaline, a peace that didn't sit right, like a room no one had finished furnishing. She accepted it, the way you accept an assigned seat at a long table, by putting your hands in your lap and listening. Administration noticed that her students failed less, bled less fuel, ambered fewer lights in the logbooks. They assigned her to rewrite portions of the training sequence, and she did it with the same economy she had learned from bad weather. Cut the drift, keep the headings, land on time. In the margins of the syllabus, she inserted a module called Discretion Under Pressure and pretended it was about wind shear. In the module, she wrote questions that sounded tactical and were, and also weren't. What does help sound like over? A bad radio. How does dusk change the shape of a roof? Who is responsible for a mistake you cannot see until the last second? The colonel signed off on it and told her it was good thinking. She nodded and said thank you, because sometimes progress arrives disguised as paperwork and needs the courtesy of a straight face. On weekends, she drove the perimeter roads with the windows down and the radio low, as if trying to match the base's pulse with her own. She stopped at the fence near the far end of the runway, where the jets lifted and were swallowed by the sky's blank appetite. She stood there with her hands hooked through the wire, not like a prisoner, but like a person who wants proof that steel and space obey the same laws. The sound of afterburners went through her chest and out her back, and she knew she would never again crave that sound the way she once had. But she also knew she would miss it if it left. That contradiction felt like weather you learn to live. Under the peace that makes you uneasy, the safety that tastes like starch. When new instructors asked for her war stories, she gave them none. She told them instead about an old mechanic who could hear a failing pump from 40 yards away, about a line chief who knew how to talk a tired pilot down without making the voice sound like a rope, about a chaplain who stood on the tarmac one night and caught a private sentence she didn't know she'd said out loud. She offered these as navigation fixes on the human chart. If they pressed for more, she said that some stories are shaped like valleys, and you don't traverse them twice without leaving pieces you were planning to need. At twilight, when the Lasorti walked through the door with the slouch of concentration coming off, she stood a little apart as debrief flowed around her. She corrected posture with 2 fingers on a shoulder blade, adjusted a voice by raising her own half an octave until imitation took over, and stepped back quickly so the student could own the improvement. On the whiteboard, she drew arcs and numbers and the occasional arrow that ended in a question mark, the only punctuation the air respects. When someone fumbled for praise, she switched the subject to habit, because habit survives panic, and panic is the only guaranteed weather. Sometimes she stayed after lights out and watched the runway from a bench where the base forgot to plant a tree. Planes lifted, lights receded, and she traced their climb with a fingertip against the railing, as if signing a letter to a person who could no longer receive it. In those moments, the past didn't lunge. It just sat beside her, a presence with decent manners, and she learned to share the bench. She had not become simpler or braver or kinder. She had simply become a person who knows which ghosts need speaking to and which require silence. The world called it healing. She called it maintenance. When the evening finally cooled and the silence settled back over the field like a sheet, she rose, touched the dog tag beneath her collar as if checking a buckle, and walked a long way to the lot. Behind her, a trainer rolled to a stop and the engine ticked as it shed heat. Ahead, the admin building waited with its fluorescent hum and tomorrow's schedules. She moved through the space between with the measured pace of someone who no longer mistakes speed for progress. And if the air smelled, for a fleeting second, like cordite and pines, she let it pass. The consequences hadn't washed away. They had been filed, labeled, stacked on a shelf inside her where she could reach them without letting them fall. And when a distant jet finally clawed into the dark, she didn't turn to follow it. She let the sound go on without her, a river she had crossed and did not need to cross again. The afternoon light slanted across the ramp with the warmth of old brass, and the day's last sorties taxied in with noses lifted like swimmers breaking surface, while Evelyn stood at the chalked edge of the instructor's box and waited for the echo of turbines to settle into the steady murmur that let thought return at its own speed. She had spent the morning sanding roughness off check rides and the early afternoon sorting debrief sheets into neat piles that looked like calm when stacked. And now, the sun was low enough to turn visor edges into thin bands of fire. She watched the students unstrap with that small, private relief of having kept the contract between sky and ground intact for one more circuit. And she found herself counting breaths instead of seconds as the bustle thinned and the base exhaled toward evening. A new pilot peeled away from his crew with a nervous brightness that had not yet been scuffed by weather or reports, holding his helmet by the rim, the way people hold a question they don't quite want answered. And he hovered at the quartering angle of conversation until courage and curiosity made a truce. He asked, not flippantly but not cautiously either, whether she had ever flown under real fire, the kind that changes the sound inside your head, and whether it felt different from the simulations they practiced until muscle replaced doubt. She let the silence do the first part of the work, seeing the shadow of her own younger posture in the set of his shoulders, and then she said that real was a word that moved its furniture when you weren't looking, that what mattered was how you kept your hands kind to the controls when the world refused to be. In that some heat you only understand by the color it leaves on your sleep. He nodded with the gratitude of someone given enough to carry without being fed a story, and he repeated her words back in pieces, as if testing their fit against a place he had not yet visited. They walked the line together with the unhurried steps of people measuring distance by the length of thought rather than by yards, and she pointed out scuffs on a tire that would become a lecture tomorrow and a habit next week. And she showed him how a hinge whispers about fatigue long before it complains, and he took notes that he would misplace and then rewrite from memory, which is the only way knowledge learns your handwriting. His questions loosened as the light thinned, running toward tactics and then away again, and he told her, with a self-conscious grin that tried to make room for humility, that he had grown up near a commercial airport and loved to fall asleep to the ascent. And she found herself saying that the descending sound is the one you learn to hear later because it tells you how to come home. The evening wind lifted, with the casual authority of weather that doesn't care about schedules, carrying the faint tang of fuel and scorched rubber as if to remind anyone listening that flight leaves a taste even on days no one mentions it. And the base began its little rituals of closure, cones nested, chalk stacked, hangar doors sliding toward each other, with the domestic finality of cupboards shutting after a long meal. An instructor across the way laughed too loudly at a joke that wasn't meant to last, and the young pilot beside her pretended not to listen while he listened, learning which tones belong in a ready room and which go stale under neon. She checked the logbook against the tail numbers with a pen whose click kept an honest tempo, and when she handed the book back, she placed her palm flat on its cover for a second longer than needed, a gesture that passed for blessing among people who don't use the word. He tried one last question, this one softer, about whether the years after the cockpit felt like a hallway that keeps forgetting to lead somewhere. And she smiled in a way that made the skin beside her eye fold with history rather than age. And she told him that some hallways are where you learn the weight of doors before deciding which to open, and that there are days when you will be grateful to know exactly where a corridor ends. He bowed his head, not in agreement but in attention, and then muttered an apology for keeping her, and she lifted a hand to wave it away with a motion that ended before it became comfort. Because comfort has its own economy on airfields and must be paid for with more than the afternoon leaves in the till. When she turned toward the hangar, a gust moved along the tarmac like a rumor, and the sound followed it, the heavy, ground-filling growl that belonged only to certain engines and certain intentions, rolling in from the far side of the field with the unhurried confidence of a thing that knows it will be recognized. She stopped with her foot half-placed, the sole hanging over painted line, and felt her insides make that small, involuntary adjustment they had learned years ago, as if each rib wanted to shift for a better view. An A-10 climbed lazy over the horizon, banked enough to show the belly that once had been her vantage and her weapon and her argument. And for a heartbeat, the air around her carried the earlier life, the way clothes keep a scent after a drawer has been closed for months. The pilot leveled and continued, indifferent as weather, and the sound flattened and stretched until it was only a pressure on the skin, the sort that argues with the quiet long after the source has gone. She let the young man watch it longer than politeness requires, because some recognitions arrive on a frequency no classroom can tune. And when he lowered his head again, she found her hand already at her collar, the chain warm against her fingertips. Ethan's tag, riding its usual circle beneath the fabric in the spot where contact could be mistaken for adjustment. She did not speak his name, not because names lose sharpness when said too often, but because there are days when the contour of the absence is exact enough without being traced. Instead, she breathed in the slow way she had taught anxious students to breathe before short finals, letting the chest fill and empty without negotiation. And she began to walk again, while the last of the sound finished diluting itself into ordinary evening. Inside the hangar, a ladder stood where a mechanic had forgotten to return it to the wall, and she moved it with the quiet efficiency that keeps small chaos from pretending to be larger. And she set out tomorrow's checklists on the cart in a row that would make the duty tech smile, because order, like grief, prefers to be recognized without being announced. She initialed a maintenance form with the neat signature she had inherited from a father who never rushed a line. And she circled a note about a sensor behaving more like a suggestion than a fact. And she put the pen exactly back into its groove. Not out of compulsion, but out of courtesy to the workbench that had learned to expect it. Her phone buzzed once, with a message she did not need to read now, and she silenced it with the gentleness one shows a child already asleep. On the way out, she traced, with an absent fingertip, the flaked paint on a bulkhead where years of gloves had rubbed impatience into a pattern that looked almost intentional. And she thought, without bitterness, that this was how decisions wear themselves into metal and then into people, not as scars that announce themselves, but as smoothed edges you notice only when you reach for a grip that used to bite. The ramp was almost empty. A single ground truck ambled toward the far gate, with the self-importance of things that are useful and tired. And somewhere a radio played a song whose chorus had forgotten what the verses promised. And she smiled at the ordinariness, as if it were a visitor who sometimes stayed too long but never wrecked the couch. She paused at the threshold and looked back once, not for drama, simply to confirm that the space would remain itself without her in it for a few hours. And the confirmation arrived in the form of nothing happening, which felt right. The sky over the field had cooled to a blue that would be black in 10 minutes, and the first star had managed its usual trick of appearing where she was not looking. And she thought about how years had taught her to accept arrivals without rehearsing welcomes. She slid the hangar door until the latch caught with a sound she could identify from its echo alone, and she walked the long concrete toward the lot, with the stride that her body had adjusted to since the days when strides meant time on target. And the dog tag tapped its small metronome against her sternum to remind her that clocks can be carried inside and outside without contradiction. At the car she rested, her hand on the roof before opening the door, feeling the metal's stored heat climb into her palm and then leave it. And in that exchange, there was the simplest kind of truth she trusted now. Touch, transfer, release. She did not look at the sky again to catch another plane. She did not seek omens in wind patterns or ask for messages from machines that owed her nothing. She sat, closed the door with the soft authority of a person who has learned not to wake whatever sleeps, and let the engine's small vibration settle into the background where it could keep company with other small vibrations that would never leave. Driving out, she waited at the base gate while the guard scanned the badge and waved with the distant courtesy of people who will always be temporary in each other's stories. And she returned the wave with a motion neither cheerful nor grim, the median strip of adulthood where most gestures live. The town beyond the fence was already turning its lights on in windows that had dinner in them, and she let a pedestrian cross with the patience that used to cost her effort. And she noticed, not without surprise, that the world did not feel like it was moving past her so much as around her, and that she could be a fixed point without being stuck. When the distant roar finally thinned to a memory that would not entirely obey, she did not try to call it back, and she did not try to bury it. She let it find its level inside her the way water does when left alone, and she understood without sentence or ceremony that the sound would remain, not as a headline unscrolling forever, but as a tone she could sometimes hear under dishes and paperwork and laughter happening in adjacent rooms. She drove on, a little tired, a little steadier, with nothing resolved and everything arranged just enough for the next day to begin. And the night gathered gently, without making promises or threats. And her hands, those careful, stubborn hands, stayed easy on the wheel.